Hey there! This video is going to introduce you to the September-October LD topic, which is, in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. In this video, we're going to start by breaking down some keywords and phrases in this resolution, namely democracy and compulsory voting. I've also listed below some core actors to think about in doing your research. So these are the stakeholders that would be most affected by this policy, by the implementation of a compulsory voting policy. So that would be democratic governments, voters, politicians, and political parties within those governments. So let's start with democracy. What is a democracy? A democracy is a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. This is a dictionary definition, but what I like about it is that it notes that democracy is often characterized by free elections. And if you're confused about democracy, what it looks like, how it's different from other forms of government, I would strongly encourage you to look into some resources online. We'll talk a little bit about the Pew Research Center. They produce lots of research on not only sort of documenting how many democracies exist in the world, but also sort of quantifying how effective those democracies are at working. So in terms of global trends, 57% of countries are considered democracies of some kind. So in some ways, the people of a state in these places have some control over who holds office. This is important to note because this resolution speaks about democracies generally, so it's not limited to any one particular state. And this percentage, 57%, is just below what the global percentage was after World War II, which was the period in which the highest number of democracies flourished. So constraints on the chief executive, openness of political participation, and public satisfaction are all among factors that are used to gauge the effectiveness of democracies. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit more toward the end of the video. What makes a democracy effective or ineffective, and how does compulsory voting fit in with that? But we first need to define compulsory voting. So compulsory voting is pretty straightforward. It basically is just a requirement in some countries that eligible citizens register to vote and vote in elections. The difference between a country that has compulsory voting and a country that doesn't have compulsory voting is usually in penalties for people who don't vote. So for example, in the United States, as you note at the bottom of this slide, we do not have compulsory voting. The United States is considered a democracy, but if folks, choose not to vote, they're not penalized for that. But an important thing to note about systems of compulsory voting is that even when they do exist, no two systems look the same. So variations in voting age, registration processes, and enforcement for particular subgroups can look very different. An example of this is that in some countries in Latin America, mandatory voting is not enforced for voters who are 70 years old or older. Variations also exist in penalties for abstention, and I'll note quickly here, when you see the word abstention or abstaining, all that means in the context of this particular video is just folks who choose not to vote, who consciously, deliberately make the decision to not vote. So in Costa Rica, as an example, voting is something that's listed as a civic duty in the Constitution, but there are no fines, penalties that are enforced for those who don't vote or who abstain. But in Australia, there's actually a fine imposed if you choose not to vote. I'm not sure the number is $20 USD anymore. This was from a 2016 study, but anyway, it's a small fine that folks are required to pay when they choose not to vote. And I also wanted to dive into two examples of what compulsory voting looks like, a little bit more deeply, just to give us a sense of, okay, what do these policies need to make them work? What do they actually look like when they're implemented? So in Australia, this is both Australia and Brazil actually are countries that have had compulsory voting in place since the 20th century and have had varying levels of success. So in Australia, features of compulsory voting include a fine for non-compliance, so if you don't vote, you get fined, a requirement that elections are held on weekends, and widespread use of mail-in ballots. Whereas in Brazil, features of compulsory voting include a fine for non-compliance, automatic voter registration, and potential restrictions on the ability of abstainers to receive passports or government-backed loans if they choose not to vote, which obviously the two penalties implemented are very different, which has an effect on not only how it's implemented, but how these rules are followed, which we'll talk about more later on. So in order to think through this policy, we should talk about where compulsory voting has worked best. So general statistics suggest that there are reasons that it's been implemented, right? So 29 countries employ some form of compulsory voting. This might sound like a lot, but that's roughly 30% of the world's democracies, which is not a huge number. So Argentina, Australia, and Belgium are some of the world's first countries to adopt compulsory voting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I know I mentioned Brazil as well, also the 20th century, but that was, I believe, in like the 1980s, so it was a bit later. And they've all seen mixed success. So one of the biggest issues with voting in any democracy is its issue of turnout. Turnout basically just means, okay, of the eligible voting pool, how many of these people are actually turning in ballots or casting a vote? Even in places where compulsory voting exists, i.e. where voting is required, turnout is not 100% for multiple reasons. But in particular, illegal absenteeism, so people who are just not voting, and invalid ballots, which we'll talk about a little bit. But for the most part, invalid ballots just means that someone's filled out a ballot incorrectly so it can't be voted. This looks different in different places, but doing things like not filling in the bubbles correctly, not filling in bubbles for multiple parts of the candidates. So if you get a ballot, right, there's a long list of candidates' measures that you're supposed to be voting on. And in some places, ballots are considered invalid if you only fill out maybe one or two of those little bubbles. And there are also differences in implementation of compulsory voting that do yield differences in both turnout and descriptive representation. We'll talk more about descriptive representation, but in the context of this video, it really just means, folks that are actually represented in office. When I say representation, it speaks to like specific demographics. So for example, this article that's cited here, this DeVroe article is about the number of women who are actually in elected office in places that have compulsory voting. So as an example of the sort of mixed success point, turnout rates in Australia were over 90% in 2016, but factors such as ranked choice voting and availability of mail-in ballots influence this number. And a similar situation happened in Brazil. 80% turnout rates happened in the same year, but factors such as a lower voting age and automatic voter registration influence this number. I say these things to remind us all that while compulsory voting has many goals, including increasing turnout, there are a number of other policies that influence whether or not folks are, the ability to which people can actually turn out or want to. So for example, like in Brazil, having a really low voting age has a different impact on turnout than something like ranked choice voting. And now let's talk about where compulsory voting has failed, right? So obviously the vast majority of democracies don't have compulsory voting, but there are actually a number of states that at one point had compulsory voting and got rid of it. So general statistics, arguably you could say that compulsory voting fails everywhere. Right, but that's not the point of the resolution. We're having a debate about it. Analysis of recent elections in Australia and Brazil, using our earlier example, claims that up to 20% of voters refuse to participate. So these are the folks who abstain, but this number doesn't actually include voters who leave their ballots incomplete or whose ballots are actually uncountable. So the turnout number just speaks to like how many people submitted ballots. Greece, the Dominican Republic, and Venezuela are all countries that have implemented and later abandoned compulsory voting policies. Obviously, the political climate and factors sort of in those decisions for each of those places are very different, but generally, these policies tend to fail in places political climate where the public is like very against compulsory voting, it's perceived as ineffective, and it just sort of doesn't yield tangible results over time. But there's a reason still that people, politicians, leaders, activists, think that compulsory voting is a good idea. So in this slide, we're just going to talk about the case for compulsory voting. Why would anyone want this? The first reason is low voter turnout. This is a problem with every democracy that has ever existed. An example here, once again talking about Australia. Australia adopted compulsory voting policies after turnout dropped more than 10% in the 1924 election from what it had been previously. Historically low voter turnout has always been an issue, and the idea is that compulsory voting would solve this because if folks had to vote, they would vote in order to avoid penalties, which would then increase turnout. In Australia, it increased it rather significantly, arguably. All right. The second issue is representation issues. So this is another place where folks have thought compulsory voting could actually do a lot of good. There's a correlation between low turnout and gender, race, and socioeconomic status, among other factors. So what does this mean? It means that historically, folks in democracies who have tended to have the least access to voting have also tended to fall into categories that are often marginalized for various reasons within those particular states. So the idea is that compulsory voting can actually help erase certain barriers that exist to voting because once everyone's required to do it, this is often accompanied by policies that also just make it easier to vote. So having things like a holiday on election day, or having access to mail-in ballots, or automatically registering voters, etc., etc. There's also a correlation between low turnout by demographic and representation in elected office. So if particular demographics of folks are not voting a lot, it's less likely, some studies suggest, that they would actually be represented in elected office. But once again, one thing I want to point out about these particular points is that they're very general in terms of studies that look at compulsory voting. Turnout by demographic looks very different between individual states, so we don't want to overgeneralize here, but it's definitely something that you should look into more specifically if you're concerned or interested in research on turnout by demographic. Okay, the final point is civic engagement. Compulsory voting is tricky because the major question is is it in line with values of democracy and civic engagement? Some would argue yes, every citizen has a duty to vote, and that should be enforced. They should be turning out, and to make democracy work, right? The only reason it works is if people participate, and if people are not participating, then that's a problem. That creates an issue for democracy. So that's that argument. But all of these arguments can be sort of flipped on their head. So the case against compulsory voting actually looks very similar. The first issue with compulsory voting that folks have really started to call out is compromised election quality. So unengaged and disinterested voters that are also referred to in some of this literature as unsophisticated voters, these are the people who were not voting before, but who are now voting because they're required to. There is research that indicates that even when they're required to vote, they don't actually do things like read up on candidates or look into issues, they just fill out their ballots. Which results in things like a compromised election quality insofar as you're not actually getting a sense of what those who are engaged in issues are actually caring about, right? If someone doesn't care and they're just filling things out randomly on a ballot, it doesn't actually give a sense of whether or not that issue is important to them. So it compromises the overall quality of the election by, casting a vote that maybe doesn't really matter to someone or reflect what that person would want for themselves. But also leads to a lot of invalid balloting. So people will just not fill them out completely or fill them out incorrectly. And when this happens, invalid balloting tends to happen when folks who are really just not interested in voting or weren't interested in before begin voting. Okay. The second primary issue in the case against compulsory voting is this issue of representation that we talked about on the last slide. There are two questions here that folks have tried to answer. The first is, does compulsory voting materially reduce inequality? The sort of argument here on the flip side of this that we talked about is that if we encourage people to vote or we force people to vote, make it easier for them to vote, then people who were not voting before will have an opportunity to weigh in on policies and they will vote for things that will help them. But I think that in order for that argument to be true, there are a lot of assumptions that are required. So when you're thinking about this on the negative, think through what assumptions are required to prove that argument is valid. And if you start to sort of pick it apart, it kind of gets to the issue of representation, that just having more people voting doesn't necessarily result in better policies or policies that benefit those people. And the second question is, does compulsory voting increase the representation of marginalized groups in the electorate and or the elected? Once again, this is something that depends more on particular states, but there's plenty of literature out there that suggests that this type of descriptive representation that compulsory voting is supposed to solve in some ways can actually not have an impact, or in some situations make it worse. One of the primary arguments for why representation of marginalized folks gets worse is that when people who did not vote before are required to vote, they will just fill out the most popular candidates, or candidates that tend to fall in line with, those candidates who tend to represent aspects of privilege within that given society, which is an issue, right? Because the most popular candidates tend to be candidates that already occupy a social location of a lot of relative privilege, right? They've had elite education, they often have a lot of money, they have a lot of access to sort of financing and like friends who are in politics, et cetera, however you want to think through it. So the question here is definitely a fair one that's debated a lot statistically, and definitely something that could make for a great case against compulsory voting. Okay, the final point that we're going to talk about is civic engagement. On the flip side of that question of civic duty, there's also a question of whether or not forcing someone to vote actually violates democratic principles, insofar as, like, the act of not voting, many people consider a political act, and something that is well within their rights to do. So there's disagreements between theorists over the right to abstain versus the duty to participate. The final thing I want to talk about, so now that we've gone through all that information, is just how COVID-19 will influence voting. This is important just because, as this is ongoing, it's influenced a lot of talk about elections. And global trends, as a result, mail-in ballots are becoming increasingly common. So in the United States, in particular, 1 in 4 votes are cast by mail. In 2018 alone, that number is increasing. But the virus has also resulted in delayed elections, individual states increasing mail-in ballots in the US, and changes in voting practices are definitely happening here. They're happening in other places, but these changes are often correlated with the country's response and case level. So for example, in a place like New Zealand or Taiwan, where there have not been any, I believe there are not any new cases in both of those places for a significant period of time, probably not going to actually change how people vote, because people are able to do things like go into work, go back to school, etc., etc. So the long and the short of it is, there are increased calls for compulsory voting, but they're not necessarily spurred by concerns over the virus, and the relevance of the virus to this topic remains uncertain. What it will probably influence, if anything, is app implementation mechanisms. So that's what probably would be most directly impacted by the virus, but I would not be too concerned about it in your research if I were you. Anyway, that sums up our video for today. Thanks for watching.